I want to talk to you about the boy next door. I first noticed him when we arrived here. Mum was moving in all of our boxes and furniture, and I was sitting on one of Mum's boxes labelled Fragile, downing ice-cold lemonade. This wasn't exactly the weather for cold drinks, but I was pooped after spending my morning and half of my afternoon going back and forth with all our stuff. It was just a glimpse. One of the movers asked me to help him with a box of kitchen equipment. I was struggling to get a proper grip of it, twisting around to shout that I needed help, when I saw him. Not much of a person, more of a shadow poking from behind the fence. What I could make out was a tallish figure and mousy brown hair. I lifted my hand in a greeting, but the guy walked away. I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was shy. Though I was curious about my neighbors, I was expecting them to join the parade of families on our doorstep, harboring every food you can imagine. But they stayed away. I did know a family existed next door, however. There was a large wooden fence separating us, so if I really wanted to talk to them, I'd either have to grow several feet taller or invest in stilts. I'm not sure why I was so obsessed with meeting them. I knew they had kids my age. I could hear them. Whether they were arguing over video games or laughing at something trivial, I could always hear them when I was sitting on our wooden porch or helping Mum clean our yard. According to Mum, who heard it from a nice lady across the street, our neighbors were called the Wilders. There was a single mum and her 4 teenage kids. I thought. So Mystery Shadow Guy must have been a Wilder kid. I was told to not get too excited, though. Apparently, Mrs. Wilder was very protective over her children, and even homeschooled them. So there was no chance of me making friends or even getting to know them. On our second day in our new home, Mum told me over breakfast that Mrs. Wilder had sent out a polite notice to the neighborhood that her children were not to be disturbed or talked to, which was crazy. I thought that was weird, but Mum understood it, and to my annoyance, accepted the woman's notice. I was warned not to talk to the Wilder children, and if I did, that was an automatic week grounding, which meant no dinner, no seeing friends after school, and my phone privileges taken away. According to her, she figured they were just a private family and wanted to accept that. She theorized the kids had been bullied at a public school and had to be homeschooled. But I was skeptical. All of them? I'd asked her through a mouthful of cereal. Phoebe? Mum sent me a warning look, sipping her coffee. What we're going to do is respect Mrs. Wilder's wishes. It's child abuse, I muttered into my frosted flakes, only for Mum to reach across the table and poke me with the prongs of her fork. Ow! Don't play with your food. I'm not playing with my food. I held up a spoonful of soggy cereal. You just never get the chocolate brand. These taste like sandpaper. We are going to be respectable neighbours, Mum said, ignoring me. So you are not going to speak to those kids. Do you understand? I knew Mum only wanted to abide by the weird rules because she was obsessed with joining the Mums Club, or whatever they called it. But it didn't make sense to me that this woman wasn't letting her own kids have a social life. At a younger age, maybe 11 or 12, I could understand. But 17? That was almost college age. What? Was she expecting to coddle them forever? Did she really think these kids were going to stay with her? 17 was the age of finding first loves and making mistakes, not staying at home with Mummy Dearest. Okay, but would you do this to me? I asked her. Would you really lock me up and stop me from going outside and living my life? Mum had been spreading butter on bread. I didn't realize her mood had drastically changed until she was almost slicing her finger with the knife. "You don't know this yet because you're far too young." She lifted her head, her lips curving into a smile. "But there is something called a mother's instinct. When our children are born, we are overcome with an almost feral need to protect them from danger. If you look it up, it is present in every creature, every mother. Our children are worth more than ourselves. We give our own lives to keep them alive. You can roll your eyes and say it's stupid, but I'm sure as soon as you have your own children, you will feel the exact same with them." She nodded at me. "I had that with you. I still have it with you, Phoebe, no matter how old you are. When you were a baby, I wanted to hold you in my arms every second of every day. I hated it when people wanted to hold you, and you were such a clingy baby, and always cradled to my chest. As you grew up, I started to understand that you were seeing the world for the first time, and you needed your own space and time. I let you take your first steps on your own. I cried when you said your first word, and when I grabbed your hand and raced down the kindergarten steps for the first time, letting you go was painful. And if I had a choice in the matter, yes, I would keep you in here. I would stop you from going outside and seeing this world." She dropped the knife with a startling metallic clang before picking it back up. "Because this planet is a scary place, Phoebe. And as mothers, it is our job to keep our kids safe, even if that means going to the slightest of extremes." "Slightest of extremes?" I scoffed, despite knowing I was being pedantic. "They have to fly the nest. That's called growing up." Ignoring her glare, I continued. "Yes, I believe in mother's instinct. But at what point do you have to look at yourself and realize you're being ridiculous? 17-year-olds aren't infants. They won't just blindly walk into traffic. They have self-awareness of what is wrong and right." I pointed at myself. "You let me drive, right? I got my license. Where was your mother instinct when I got myself a big girl vehicle I could have easily had an accident in?" Mum curled her lip. "Don't push it." Leaning across the table, I fixed her with a smile. "See, you trust me, Mum. You let me grow up. That's the difference between you and Mrs. Wilder. Kids have to grow up, no matter what the circumstances are. We all grow up and leave our parents." I sent her a look, stirring the soggy soup of my cereal. "Well, unless you're Mrs. Wilder." Mum finished her coffee and stood up. "You don't even know these children. They could be in any stage of development which makes them very different to you. All kids mentally age at different points." She took her plate to the faucet and dumped it in the bowl. Mum washed the dishes when she was angry or stressed, and she was really going to town on our brand new pattern plates. I saw that as a mark of finality. "I'm done talking about this, okay? You're not 18 yet, which means you abide by my rules. And really, Phoebe, I'm not exactly holding you prisoner. I'm just asking you to be polite and follow a simple rule which is not hard. We are a new family, and we need to make a good impression, which means no talking to Mrs. Wilder's children." She cleared her throat. "Respect our neighbours' wishes, or lose your phone." Ducking my head, I continued to stir my cereal into a mushy soup which had quickly become unappetizing. It looked like barf. I pushed it away. "You only want me to follow the rules so you can get into Mrs. Becker's book club and go on pirate dates with middle-aged Karens." Mum dropped a plate in the sink, and the sound of the splash made me flinch slightly. "Is that understood?" Yes, I said, rolling my eyes. Obviously, I will abide by the street's draconian rules so I can continue scrolling through TikTok. It was sarcasm, but I wasn't sure my mother could detect it. She was so blinded by becoming one of our neighbors. Why was she so obsessed with meeting all of the other mums anyway? Was she planning on setting me up on a play date with 3-year-old Evie? I wouldn't put it past her doing that for brownie points. Good. End of conversation, Mum said, hurrying to get her jacket and bag. I'm late for work, and you have an induction to get to. I wanted to argue further because this sounded unfair. The kids were teenagers, right? How were they not arguing against this? It seemed insane that they were going along with what their mothers said. But I was aware of a significant punishment if I broke this rule. So I begrudgingly agreed. After my induction, I asked around new friends and classmates if anybody knew of the Wilder kids. And they did. But they didn't want to elaborate on what they knew. I heard a lot of rumors with dead ends. Most of them involved a father who had walked out on them, and their mother going into ultra-protective mode in response. It sounded like these kids were bearing the brunt of a messy divorce. They were complete enigmas. I didn't know anything about them except from their insanely overprotective mother's wicked grip on them. I gave up being curious. Mum was serious about me not speaking to them. She gave me a lecture on respecting the woman's privacy and blah blah blah. I tuned out after 5 minutes, my attention flicking to an episode of Breaking Bad playing on the lounge TV. The next few weeks were boring. Mum was invited to join Mrs. Becker's book club, so on Mondays at 5 p.m, I made myself scarce. I did exactly what Mum said. I ignored the kids next door. My bedroom happened to be facing the room of one of the kids, but their dark blue curtains were always shut. Sometimes it was hard. When I was sitting in the yard reading a book, I could hear them on the other side of the fence. The boys were the most vocal, laughing and teasing each other. There was a point when I risked it. I jumped to my feet and got halfway across the expanse of grass, standing on the tips of my toes and trying to catch a peek. But Mum was calling me inside. I swore she had eyes in the back of my head. Mum always knew when I was outside, when I was near the fence. It wasn't until a month had gone by when I finally got a glimpse of a Wilder kid. I had just gotten back from school. I dumped my backpack on my bed and grabbed my phone, slumping onto my bed to text my friends and mindlessly scroll through social media. I noticed movement at the corner of my eye, and when I lifted my head, blinking rapidly, those same blue curtains which had shut me out for what felt like so long, they were open. Not just that. I could see a bedroom, smothered in personality. I glimpsed a hardwood desk, strewn with paper and an expensive laptop, a blue bedspread, a beaten-up guitar leaning against the light green walls covered in old-school movie posters. There were screwed-up pieces of paper everywhere. I had to guess he was some kind of artist. The room was illuminated in the evening dim, a soft warm light bringing the room to life. A knock startled me, and my gaze flicked to the window. There he was, the Wilder boy next door. He was my age, maybe even older. This guy looked almost college-aged, which made it increasingly weirder that his mother would insist on babying him at the age of 17. He was cute, the dorky kind of cute. He wore bulky glasses, but was the type to instantly suit pretty much anything. If I could compare him to anyone, it would be the mental image in my head that my younger self had imagined Percy Jackson when I read the books. The guy looked comfortable in a sweater and jeans, mousy brown hair hanging in warm eyes. There was an inquisitive smile on his lips. I jumped up to open my window and to speak to him, but he shook his head, and I quickly remembered his mother's stupid rule which forbid us from talking. So I got creative. "Give me a moment," I mouthed. I expected him to ignore me and go back to what he was doing, but the guy straightened up and nodded, arching a brow. He was intrigued. I grabbed an old notebook and a pen and sat on my bed, scribbling a message. I wrote, "Hello, so you're the kid under house arrest, LMAO." When I held it up, his smile bricked. He laughed, but I couldn't hear it. I could tell he had a dorky kind of laugh, a nasally one. The guy held up a hand for me to wait and rummaged on his desk. He quickly wrote out a message and held it up with a grin. He almost looked proud of his message, and I couldn't resist my own smile. I expected him to curse his mother, maybe apologize for the lack of communication. But instead, he simply wrote, "Hello, what's your name?" followed by a slightly smudged smiley. After a moment of consideration, Mum's words echoing in my mind, I thought, fuck it. "Phoebe," I said. "Yours?" "It's nice to meet you, Phoebe," he responded, which spanned multiple conversations which took up several of my notepads. We talked about everything from school to his life at home. He had 3 siblings, Matilda, Freddie, and Isaac. He liked to play the guitar and draw, but also apparently sucked at both. When I asked what his favorite TV show was, he looked confused for a moment before answering. All of them. Following that odd answer, I asked if he liked Marvel. And again, he had that look. A look of confusion. But I knew he was trying to make a good impression. "What is Marvel?" He wrote back, this time his handwriting in a bubbly font. I could almost call his writing calligraphy. It practically danced off of the page. The Wilder boy's strange answers made me wonder if this kid had been homeschooled his whole life. He seemed way too polite. Kids were polite, sure. There was a certain amount of respect you had to pay your elders and parents. But looking at this kid, I wasn't even sure he knew what a meme was, or even the concept of a joke. He had no idea about one of the biggest movie franchises in the world, and his favorite celebrity was apparently all of them. In fact, he had answered all of them to several of my questions. His messages reminded me of my grandma's. Still, though, he was good company. Though I made it my mission to convert him to a normal teenager. I had to guess, due to constantly being home and around the same people, this kid had 0 social skills. I asked him what his favorite movie was, out of the posters on the wall. He had Kill Bill, Reservoir Dogs, and Fight Club. Again, he looked confused, his head cocked to one side, and I had to physically point to them behind him. "All of them," he wrote back with a smiley face. Damn. This kid needed to see a movie which wasn't some educational shit. I bet his mother had turned him into a perfect member of society. "What have you seen?" I couldn't help asking him. "Like, movies, TV shows. Do you play video games?" He shook his head before scribbling back. "What is that?" Holy shit. This kid was completely cut off from the outside world. I was already mentally thinking up plans to get him out of the house and to a party or something like that. From the look of this kid's face, a slightly blank if not completely innocent smile, he needed time away from home, away from his overprotective mother's wicked grasp. After a while, I realized he never told me his name. I didn't notice time go by. Almost 3 hours, and I'd spent most of it lecturing him on movies and TV shows he really should have known. I guessed Mrs. Wilder didn't let him watch the TV. My gaze flicked to his laptop, and I wouldn't have been surprised if she had blocked out all social media. My notepad was full of scribbles and doodles, an attempt at copying his handwriting style. The sky was blooming into twilight outside, thick orange and cotton candy pink streaming the horizon. I've always loved a pre-twilight sky. "What's your name?" I wrote in marker pen, before holding up my notepad. I was running out of paper. I could hear Mum downstairs preparing dinner, and I could tell from his diminishing smile Mrs. Wilder was probably shouting for him to go downstairs. He didn't reply for a while. I watched him put the pad down, before heading over to his desk and cleaning up the paper. Every trace we had been talking, and dumping each response he'd given in the trash, before he slumped onto his bed, wrote something down in several strokes, before holding it up for me to see. "Casper," he'd written. "My name is Casper Wilder." For a moment his expression changed completely. He glanced at the door, before frowning at the pad of paper on his lap. It looked like he wanted to write more, before twisting around, his eyes widening. Someone was coming. I could tell by the look on his face, the knot between his brows. Casper gathered everything he'd been using to write to me, pens and pencils, the scraps of paper and the backs of movie posters, and shoving them under his bed. Then he grabbed the curtains and pulled them closed, blocking me out once again. I thought he'd come back, but after standing like an idiot with an odd feeling in my gut, frowning at his curtains, I realized he was finished talking to me for the night. What I expected was that to be it. I didn't think he'd come back. The next morning, however, he was back at his window, smiling at me through a mouthful of toothpaste. He was still in his pajamas, unbrushed curls falling in sleepy eyes. He looked strange without his glasses, like his face was too bare. The more I took him in, though, something was different, though I couldn't make it out. It hit me then. Casper wasn't moving, staying in the same position. The night before, he had gone to and from his bed, hurrying around to grab equipment to write with. But now he was stood, looking more shadow than human. I was quick to dive for my notepad, but Casper was already holding up his own greeting with a grin. "Good morning, Phoebe. How are you feeling today?" "Tired," I wrote back, my writing barely comprehensible. "Do you have school?" "Yes," he responded with an excited smile. "I'm so excited to learn. Do you have a favorite class?" I laughed at that, and after looking confused, he copied my laugh, which made me laugh harder. "None of them," I scribbled back. "School is boring." Casper shrugged. "I like it. I have a great tutor." "Really?" This time I drew an attempt at a rolling eyes emoji. "You shouldn't be excited for school, weirdo." He curled his lip. "You're the weirdo," he wrote back. Casper paused, chewing on the lid of the pen, before writing, "What's a weirdo?" "You're kidding." This time, with too much vigor, I pointed to him with a laugh. You're the weirdo." We talked as I got ready for school, gathering all my books and homework. I was stuffing my gym clothes in a bag, when I noticed something was on the ground behind Casper. Looking closer, it looked like a cord. Like a long cable sort of thing. I thought it was for a games console, but then I remembered he had no idea what a video game was. I didn't question what it was for a while. We talked every night, about everything and nothing. I told Casper about school and friends, filling up every piece of paper we had in the house, and he told me about his siblings. They were all the same age, and all enjoyed school. His brother was a piano prodigy, while his sister's strongest subjects were math. Casper told me he felt like the odd one out, being the artist of the family, and I quickly told him that creativity was the best part of a person. He showed me his drawings, and to my confusion and slight disgust, they were all of his mother. They were good, sure. His skills were Ivy League worthy. Perfect shading, everything about the drawings was perfect. But the fact that his muse was his mother put a weird taste in my mouth. He showed me each drawing, his smile widening with excitement, while I nodded and pretended to be impressed. Well, I was. Though it became startlingly obvious that Casper didn't have a choice on who he drew. He didn't draw fruit, or landscapes, or even the sky. We live in a picturesque town, the perfect canvas for an artist. However, Mrs. Wilder was at the center of every single fucking drawing and painting. Even with different styles and angles, she was always there. And Casper Wilder saw no wrong in it. He saw no wrong in this woman taking control of every aspect of his life, his social life, his friends, education and hobbies. I half expected him to grab his guitar and start singing about her through the glass. I couldn't take it anymore. It was driving me crazy. We continued to talk through writing to each other, but soon enough, the only subject was his mother. Casper asked me if I could rate a drawing he was working on. It was her. Of course it was. I ignored him, getting to my feet and holding up the sign I had written weeks before, but I was too scared to show him. I didn't want to ruin our friendship. But I had to know. I had to know several things which had been keeping me up all night. Why are you okay with your mother controlling your life? I asked in bold letters. And below that, also, I've been wondering this for a while, but what is that thing behind you? The thing behind him was at the center of my thoughts. I'd worked out it wasn't a cord for a TV or a games console, not even a laptop, or for his guitar. Not to mention it was always there, morning and evening, even at night when I spied him getting ready for bed. This thing was always on the floor, snaked across his bed. Sometimes it was even wrapped up on his desk. I couldn't understand the length of it. I asked friends at school and even the internet, but my descriptions didn't do it justice. A long, silver cord-like thing which didn't have an end. Casper blinked at my message, before he ducked his head and started writing before holding up his response. I love my mum, he said, doodling a little heart. She doesn't control my life. I like that she's in it. Below that, a follow-up message which twisted my gut. What do you mean? I don't see anything, Phoebe. Tapping my pad with my pen, I struggled to think of a response. There was no way he couldn't see this thing. It was pretty hard to miss. Instead of writing, I pointed behind him. That, I mouthed, using my lips for the first time. It felt good to actually talk to him, even if a window of glass separated us. What? His handwriting was slipping slightly, and I noticed his hands were visibly shaking. What can you see, Thebe?" This time, he stood up. I noticed something change in him, the notepad slipping off his knee. Casper turned around, scanning the room, before his eyes finally found the cord thing. His smile seemed to dampen, eyes going wide, fists clenching. "Casper," I hurriedly wrote when he didn't move for a while. His gaze was glued to the cord. I watched his eye follow it around the room, before his hand slowly raised, trembling fingers moving to his neck, and then the back of his head. Was there an insect? That's what I thought. It must have been a spider or some kind of bug which had startled him. I could only describe his expression as close to catatonic. He stood up, but then quickly slumped back down. But not like it was his choice, as if he was being dragged back down by an unseen force. Like, one minute I was looking at Casper Wilder, then I was seeing a stranger. A completely different person take over a rapidly paling face. Something snapped inside my gut when he moved forward suddenly, his arms lunging out to close the curtains. But that wasn't the end of what I saw. The boy had unknowingly left a splinter, a tiny gap allowing me to glimpse. I expected him to react to whatever had freaked him out, but instead, he simply flopped back onto his bed. This time, I noticed the silver cord jolt with his movement. He was already asleep, his eyes closed. I watched him, my heart diving into my throat. There was no way he just fell asleep like that. It was too fast. Mrs. Wilder came into his room soon after, but I only got a glimpse of her because she was already striding over to the window. I ducked behind my bed, panic creeping up my spine. I expected the woman to start yelling at me through the window, but instead, she simply pulled the curtains properly shut. Mrs. Wilder definitely saw me, and even if she didn't, Casper's messages to me were still piled on his bedsheets. I was left completely in the dark then. I stood and pressed my face against the window, fully aware that I was addicted to the mystery surrounding my neighbor. My mind began to wander to uncertain and scary places. What exactly was Casper's mother doing to him behind the curtain? I wanted to believe she was simply tucking him in and saying goodnight. But the strange cord-like thing on the ground, and how he'd reacted to noticing it, for what seemed like the first time. His change in expression, like a different person had taken over him, and that person was scared, catatonic. I refused to believe Mrs. Wilder was innocent. I waited for him to draw his curtains again, but he didn't. Casper's window stayed completely blocked for days. I stopped hearing his siblings in the yard, and after days of nothing, Mum reiterated her warning to me over dinner. "No communication with the Wilder children," she told me, "which includes notes and letters." Busted. So, Mrs. Wilder knew we were talking. I wonder if she was punishing her son for breaking the rules, and that was why he had been MIA for the last few days. There's something wrong with Casper. I worked up the courage to tell Mum. The boy next door. I think Mrs. Wilder is hurting him. Hurting him? Yeah, like... I frowned. I think she can make him go to sleep when she wants. I pulled a face. Like hypnotism. Or maybe even drugs. Drugs, Mum, I said. Mrs. Wilder is drugging her 17-year-old son. That's nice, honey. Are you even listening to me? I leaned across the table, stabbing the page of her book. Mum, Casper Wilder is a total blank slate. I've told you 1,000 times. She's protecting them. She hummed. You have just seen far too many crime dramas, and your generation have been poisoned by the likes of crime entertainment. Finding what you think is your own mystery must be fun, but you are reaching, baby. Reaching? I prodded my own temple. I'm sorry, were you not listening when I told you he doesn't even know what video games are? Mum was acting weird. Usually she talked about school with me, and at least tried to engage in conversation. But she was too busy reading the book Mrs. Becker had recommended her. It was like talking to a brick. You're being ridiculous, Thebe. She turned over a page with a sigh. I've spoken to his mother. She's a lovely woman. We're having lunch next week. I met her in the grocery store. What a coincidence. I shot her a look over my phone. I was looking up child abuse helplines. You're suddenly best friends with the neighborhood witch when I'm caught talking to her son. Dropping my phone for emphasis, I stood up. If you would just listen to me, that's enough. Mum cut me off. She finished her coffee, grabbing her jacket from where it was slung over a chair. Stay out of trouble, okay? I'm heading back to work. I've left cash if you want to order pizza. You have other interests, all right? Please, leave Mrs. Wilder alone. This obsession you have with her kids is unhealthy. Why don't you stick to fiction, Yeah, no. As soon as she was gone, I sprinted to my room to see if Casper's curtains were open. To my dismay, though, they were not. Frustrated, I yanked mine shut too. Slumping onto my bed, I continued looking up helplines. I got bored soon after and started Googling cords and wires which fit the description of what I'd seen. There was a match, though it was on a weird medical website which looked like it had been made in 2005. The interface was outdated and, according to the description, it was some kind of clamping device. There were a lot of words I didn't know, and after further Googling, I was getting increasingly more confused, until my gaze flicked to a section at the bottom of the page. According to whoever wrote it, the cord in question was experimental. There weren't many in circulation, but it was mainly used in medical centers, such as specialist surgeries and hospitals. When I scrolled down, there was a diagram which showed a long cord-like thing, labeled as the body, and a sharp-looking needle. Something warm crept up my throat and I sat up, frowning at the screen. Was that it? Was that thing the end? And what did this thing even connect to? A sudden thud made me almost jump out of my skin. I slid off my bed. It was coming from my window. My curtains were still shut, blowing in the slight breeze. Slowly, I made my way over, my spine tingling. The first thing I saw was red, bright, intense scarlet splattering the Wilders boy's window. Then I glimpsed Casper. He was slamming his face into the glass, over and over again, his already bleeding nose exploding with more red. But it wasn't the boy I knew, the kid I had gotten to know over the last few months. No. This kid was a mess of torn-up clothes, bruises yellowing his eyes, and scratches sliced into his flesh. My first thought was his mum. She must have done this to him. But then my gaze was finding his bloodied nails and claw marks on his arms and cheeks. There was something white wrapped around his head. A bandage. I could glimpse red leaking through, smudging clinical white and pooling down his temples in sharp rivulets. Casper's eyes were an enigma in themselves, a mixture of fear and confusion, and almost feral look of anger and frustration. But the twitch in his lip and between his brow was evident that something was fighting that. Emotions and feelings he wasn't feeling himself. It was like looking at two different guys. One was Casper, the artist who lived next door, who ended every message with a smiley, while this twisted other self, a self which was broken out and was feral in his expression, was a whole different person. I started to realize the more I looked at him, at the mess of flesh and blood caught between his nails, and his trembling hands, every so often creeping to the back of his skull, before jolting and coming back to curl into fists, battering the window. He had clawed into his own head. Immediately I reached for my phone, but he already knew what I was going to do. "No," he mouthed, shaking his head. So I grabbed my notepad. I could barely write. "What's going on?" I held up my pad. "Are you okay? You're bleeding." Instead of using a pen and paper, Casper squinted, blinking rapidly. His handwriting was different, a manic scrawl, as he wrote in the explosion of blood on the window. When he twisted around, his gaze going to the door, the breath caught in my throat. Someone was yelling his name. I could tell by his reaction. His bloodied fingers clawed at his face and hair, at bald patches and rugged stitches lining his scalp and the back of his skull. They kept going, a narrow line of stitches all the way down his neck, and presumably his spine. My thoughts flashed back to the equipment I'd been looking up. This kind of thing was designed to bury into the brain and spinal cord. I looked for it, but the thing was nowhere to be seen on him. It was no longer on the floor. Casper struggled to write coherently. I noticed he kept swearing, his finger smudging the words he was trying to write. This was more like it, I thought. This was the kind of boy I had expected to be the kid next door. Fuck. He shook his head, his movements erratic as one hand went to the back of his head and came back slick with glistening red. Fuck. He slammed his fists into the window in frustration, but I was already seeing his message start to blossom and make sense. Who? Casper was crying. I could see that he could barely breathe, struggling to inhale, swiping at his eyes with smudged fists. I started to back away, but he continued. When he'd finished, he wrote it again and again, growing more and more fraught. I jumped when he slammed his head into the glass of the window again. At first, a part of me thought he was using his blood for paint, so he was intentionally hurting himself to draw more. But his words spelled it out for me in black and white. "Who am I?" he wrote. "Who am I?" This time I could barely even read my own handwriting. I held up a scrap of paper. "Did your mum hurt you?" I gestured to the bandage on his head, and he stumbled back, wild eyes searching for something to write with. "That woman," he scribbled in block capitals. "That woman is not my fucking mum," he wrote, before he dropped to his knees. He was still writing, but failing to show me. "I don't know who I am." He wrote the same thing 12 times, before tearing up the paper and burying his head into his lap. I gave up writing messages. "Casper!" I shouted. Then I threw a rock at his window, and he lifted his head, blinking rapidly. Gesturing for him to open up his window, he struggled with the latch for a moment before pulling it open. I stuck my head out of my own window, cold air hitting me in the face. "I'm going to help you," I managed to choke out. "Hold on, okay?" Casper clawed at his face. "Help me!" His voice was a sharp hiss. "Please, help me. I don't know who I..." His fingernails ripped into the flesh of his cheeks, but he barely seemed to feel it, to be phased. They kept going, digging into layer and layer. "I don't know who I am." He jumped up, suddenly trashing his desk and throwing his laptop against the wall. He reminded me of a child having a tantrum. In this case, though, it was more than acting out. I was sure that Casper Wilder didn't exist. "I don't know who I am. I don't know. Fuck. I don't know who I am." His eyes found mine, and I could have sworn I saw something there, buried deep, deep inside his pupil. He blinked, and it was gone. "You need to tell me what she's done to you," I said stiffly. "Tell me what she's done to your head." Casper was only growing progressively more frenzied, animalistic. He came back to the window, slamming his fists into it. Then his head, again and again, like he was trying to knock himself out. "Help me. I can't remember. I can't remember who I am. I just know. I know her." His lips suddenly twisted into a startling grin. "Mum," he whispered, his expression softening. "My mum." His gaze flicked to the desk. No. She won't like that I've made a mess. Your mum did this," I gritted out. "I'm calling the cops." His expression was scaring me. Whatever was in his eye was scaring me. But this boy needed help. He needed to be taken out of that house. "No." Casper sobered up. No. My mummy said... She said no, please." His eyes widened suddenly, seemingly noticing the mess of the window for the first time. "Oh, no." Casper stumbled back. I should clean this before my mum sees what a mess I made." His door opened, and another head poked through. Another guy. I figured it was one of his brothers, Freddie or Isaac. He too had a bandage wrapped around his head. His brother's eyes found the blood splatters, and then me. Like his mother, he strode over to the window, shutting the curtains. But I could still hear it. A mechanical whirring noise, followed by Casper's sharp breath and the sickly crunch of metal protruding through blood and bone. That was it. "Mum!" I yelled. I'd heard her come back earlier. She must have finished work early. I stumbled downstairs to tell her to call the cops, but a shadow was already looming behind the corner. Before I knew what was happening, a wet rag, stinking of pool cleaner, was being pressed over my mouth and nose. I don't remember passing out. When I woke up, I was laying on my mum's couch. It was dark outside, but the curtains were open. my foggy thoughts drunk in slivers of moon poking from between the clouds, before registering I wasn't alone. Sitting up, my stomach galloped. There was no sign of Mum, but I recognized each of the faces surrounding me. Mrs. Becker was sitting with her legs crossed, delicately sipping from a cup. And next to her, wearing a smug smile, was Mrs. Wilder. She wasn't looking at me. Instead, her eyes were lovingly glued to something which had been built over Mum's coffee table. It was made completely out of paper. The scraps of paper I had been using to talk to her son. Though there weren't just my messages. I glimpsed Casper's writing too. It was a house. I was staring at a perfect paper rendition of the Wilder house, and next to it stood 4 little paper dolls. There were no faces, no expressions, just 4 dolls, 2 boys and 2 girls. Though in her lap were more. Mrs. Wilder's nimble fingers were working to make more of them. They filled her lap, differing in sizes. "Phoebe, is it?" Her voice was smooth like chocolate. I could almost mistake it for kindness. I nodded, my heart in my throat. I was watching her create another doll. She folded a piece of paper in half, cut it in 2, and started to fold sections, bringing the doll form to life. This one, unlike the other, did have attention put into it. She had even added the birthmark on my right temple. Following that, colouring in my dark blonde hair, and finishing with my jean jacket. Mrs. Wilder didn't have to spell it out for me. When she got to the doll's head, she shocked me by tearing it off. Then she ripped off its arms and legs, and tearing its torso in half. Mrs. Wilder straightened up. "Phoebe, are you aware of a mother's instinct?" I couldn't reply. Instead, I was staring at the paper doll she had set alight. I watched smouldering orange rip into it, before she put out the fire, dropping the blackened paper doll on the carpet. For just a brief second, I could have sworn the hem of my jacket had also caught alight. Just a single flash of orange. But maybe I was seeing things. "I was pregnant with 4 beautiful children," she said softly. "As soon as I found out, I had already named them." Her smile was dreamy, melancholic. "Freddie, my little Freddie. He kicked quite a lot. Oh, and Matilda. She and her twin were quite the pair, I must say. Swiftly draining me of my energy, so I had to take medication." Mrs. Wilder chuckled. "And finally, Casper. Named after my favourite movie. I loved him with all of my heart. He was my little fighter." She quickly lost her smile, her gaze flicking to me. "I hope you understand that if you talk to, or even breathe the same air as my children again, I will rip you apart too." Mrs. Wilder never raised her voice. She didn't need to. I was terrified of her. She held up my doll for emphasis, before throwing it into the paper dollhouse. "Or perhaps you could become another daughter of mine, I couldn't move, my body paralyzed when she leaned over me, cruel eyes drinking me in. "Maybe not," she hummed. "I only take the dead or dying." Straightening up, she sighed. It's not a hard task, Phoebe. Keep away from my children, and I will keep away from you. The two of them left after that, leaving me unable to move, to breathe. They took the dollhouse, all of the paper, even my own doll. Casper has been unreachable since. Mum has hardly been at home. I'm starting to lose my mind. I don't know what to do. I don't know who or what Mrs. Wilder is. But I'm afraid she's going to keep adding to her collection. Whoever those kids are, they're not hers. I think she's taken them. She's using them as canvases, dolls, for what she's lost. Am I next? Hello, sinister listeners. If you've enjoyed this story, then you'll find all the author's information in the description below. For more content, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to succumb to the sinister.